Exposition. Exposition is information. It's information that the audience and sometimes the characters need to know in order to understand the scene or what is happening. How much information you and they must have is key to perfecting that scene. Information in a movie, of course, is what we see and what we hear. So let's look at what we see. We see historical time, we see place, we see time of day or the light or darkness in an area, we see characters, we see clothes, we see camera angles, and all the objects in the scene and where they are placed. Now, historical time, which many people indicate in their first or second slug line, many writers assume that the reader can guess simply by telling the story. But ask yourself, how? I remember reading a script for a contest, and except for some of the quirky clothes which were briefly described, and the strange dialogue, I thought the story took place in present day. A dozen pages in, the writer lets me know it's the 12th century. If it's not in a contemporary time, if it were in the past or the future, you need to clearly tell the reader that from the beginning. Place or location, that should be in the slug line, but you might want to use the next paragraph or two to add a bit more detail. Give it the importance, if it is important, because the slug line itself can't do that. Time of day. Sure, interior, exterior. They should be treated similarly in the slug line and maybe the next paragraph. When a new character enters a story, the audience or reader needs to know something about them to make that character three-dimensional. Regarding camera angles, let's keep it simple. Don't do it. Don't use them. Don't write in camera angles or camera directions of any kind. You are not the cinematographer or the director, and you have to trust me, these folks don't want you doing their job. The objects in a scene may not seem all that important. The French, though, they have a theory called mise en scene. That's what is critical in the scene is not the plot or characters or action, but what we see and where it's placed. How this is usually the job of the director or the set or the art department, you may add a few items in your screenplay to help with that. In general, however, don't overload the reader on details. Many of these factors, as a writer, you can't control. Your job is to convey the scene as you envision it and hope the filmmakers come as close to portraying your view as possible. So next, what do we hear? Well, we hear dialogue, we hear narration, we hear voiceover, we hear music and sound effects. Sometimes there are off-screen noises. Some of these you can briefly describe in your narratives. Others, it will be up to you and the filmmakers to add. One thing about putting music in a soundtrack in your screenplay, don't. You may think you have the perfect song, but suppose the rights to that song are too expensive. So if you think that music is critical in setting up a location or telling something about the character, perhaps write something like a pulsating hip-hop beat or swing music that would make Glenn Miller proud. The critical thinking is to capture and feel of the tone and the mood of the scene. So what else do we have included in the exposition? First is backstory. What is the background of your characters? Where do they come from? Where do they go to school? Who are their parents, their spouses, their sweethearts, their main squeezes? What is their work? What is their politics? What is their outlook on life? Obviously, you can't reveal all this at once. A little at a time is best. It helps the reader and or the other characters to understand who the characters are and what makes them tick. Locale. Where does the scene happen? Where does the story happen? Having things happen in Washington, D.C. sets a much different tone from Los Angeles, which is a different world altogether from Kansas. So location, location, location becomes a point of information, and it shapes your story, your characters, how the reader or audience relates to the plot and the characters. Relationships. These help the reader interpret characters, situations, and often motivations. Your characters, relatives, friends and love interests or exes, or even casual acquaintances provide vital clues that help the audience become more involved and care what happens to these people. Time, and not just the historical time period like we discussed earlier. The time of day, the season, and even the weather can affect how the reader or audience perceives the entire situation. Exposition is like good seasoning in food. It must be sprinkled in carefully, a little at a time, and it needs to be subtle, but it still must be there. So pay close attention to exposition. If you used properly, it can be a few words and descriptions that make your script go from good to wow.